We have been in the wilderness for some time now, haven't we? And that is why it seems to me we would do well to just stand still in the story before us today, before jumping onto the next story as we begin Lent. Will you join me in a spirit of prayer? Oh, gracious God, help us to become masters of ourselves so that we might become the servants of others. Take our minds and think with them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hands and work with them, and take our hearts and set them on fire with your Spirit. Amen. We would do well to stand still in the story before us, because the way of wilderness is almost by its very nature a time of testing. Wilderness requires and demands maybe that we think about, what are we doing? What are we about? Wilderness forces us to rely on what we've learned at other times and to turn to resources, both internal and external. And although we I for one can say I haven't been fasting from physical food for 40 days like in this story, I believe that we have certainly been deprived of other things that we were used to relying on. What have you been deprived of during this wilderness? Now, it's hard to say whether Jesus chose this time of testing. Mark's gospel says that the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. Our reading says he was simply led. But like Mark's gospel, we hear that he was tempted or tested the whole time he was there. And we get it now, don't we? Perhaps more than ever. We know more than ever what it's like to be tempted to rely on things which do not, in the long run, give life, help us. We know what it's like to want to receive as our own whatever the devil is offering now, that darkness. How reasonable the wish is to have some agency to shut down the voices and the vitriol, to have some power to be able to do that, to shut down the craziness just a notch. And when we know perhaps more than ever what it's like to test God, when you know what, it would just be so much easier to just stop the struggle. Stop trying to engage, stay connected, and just walk away. Instead of staying in the listening and in the discerning and in the wondering, not to mention the trying and trying again. The temptations we are invited to consider again in this Lent, in this wilderness time, in our long, long time that we've been in. Well, you know, perhaps we're not that unlike the people who lived through and were shaped by such times. Because we know what it's like to be tempted by despair, wondering where God is or how God might be working. We know what it's like to want to quit, to be tempted to quit the hard work. Oh man, and I am struck especially the hard work in this long, long wilderness time, the hard work that has often required revisiting old losses, which have inevitably and sometimes painfully resurfaced, as well as new ones, so many, too many to count sometimes. And the very real grief work that somehow now is become necessary when we recognize that the old ways that were often comfortable, if not honestly loved, the old ways, well, you know, they're likely never to work as they once did. And then, you know, I mean, where is God? How on earth is God going to provide, to give us what we need? Not only what we need with regards to how to respond to the ongoing effects of this pandemic, but, you know, how, God help us, how are we going to respond to the deepening awareness that we have of all the countless inequities that we are accountable for, whether it be in housing or education or healthcare, and it goes on and on. And then now, this war. A war where countless innocent people will suffer and die. And the very real implications of all that. How on earth is God actually going to help us? I yearn for a different telling of this story. One where the angels minister to Jesus the whole time he's out there in the wilderness, grappling with his hunger and his temptations and his exhaustion and his identity, his meaning, his purpose. Oh, angels surround him during that time. Because that's what we hear in Mark and Matthew. Now, that's not to say that angels were not there in Luke's imagination, but we can't be sure. In Matthew's telling and in Mark's also, Jesus is led or driven into the wilderness immediately in the wake of hearing the voice of God at his baptism say to him, "You are beloved." And while this also happens in Luke's gospel, there's also something that happens in between that I'm struck by this time around. Before the temptation and the testing in the wilderness, yes, first Luke points to the reality of God's beloved, of Jesus' belovedness. But Luke inserts a countless line of humans, a whole heritage that is part of Jesus' identity. of all sorts of ancestors that heard the voice of God and didn't hear the voice of God. Others in that long line for Jesus who have certainly found themselves in wilderness times, in testing times, and who emerged on the other side, just as Jesus did. Right before this wilderness time, Luke gives an account of Jesus' family tree. So it kind of makes me wonder if Jesus took the echo of God's voice with him, of his belovedness into the wilderness, but also he had as part of himself that clarity of who he was. And I wonder if that can make a difference for us, to take with us, with intention, our belovedness before God, and also that long line of people who have come before us. I wonder what it could mean for you and for me. Both those named today, and certainly Jesus. All the stories, all those countless experiences that have held you up throughout your lifetime and before you were even born. All the heroes of faith and the particular ones, even with their feet of clay. Now, Luke may not have named angels as angels, but God's messengers do come to us and are still carrying us, grounding us, inviting us to lean even deeper into the certain promise that God will provide what we need, even or especially in this particular wilderness that we find ourselves, this very, very long time. May it be so. Thanks be to God. Amen.